Everybody, this is Kelly of Roho Chief Clothing, and this is my Instagram, as you see here. And when you look here, I'm going to click on the link. It will say creator Kelly _McAlpine. That's to my personal Instagram account. But right here it says follow link to my YouTube, Facebook, and clothing below. So I'm going to click on this link right here. Then when you click on that link, then what's going to happen is that kids sports tee, as you see, baby's clothing. This is a shirt for a toddler. I even have bodysuits for babies. And then going back, I have the category for also women, tank tops. I also have polo shirts. I also have long sleeve shirts, as well as hoodies for women as well, and also for men. They have the same thing. Men tank tops, men t-shirts, got v-neck shirts, comes in a variety of colors, sizes. So, check me out if you would like to have some fashion that honors your ancestors and shows the world that you know exactly who you are and proud of it. Now, let's get into the video. Okay, so in this episode, we're also going to talk about organ harvesting and how they always want to tell, our people to be a organ donor, and how we are probably the #1 victims of being kidnapped and being used for our organs. That's what we're going to talk about in this episode, and how they're using dead bodies in order to turn it into compost to use to fertilize the soil in order to grow fruits and vegetables. Okay. The New York Times. A project to turn corpses into compost. Katrina Spade, the founder and director of the Urban Death Project, monitoring the temperature of a mound of wood chips that contains the human body. Cullowhee, North Carolina. The body of a tiny 78-year-old woman, gray hair falling over stiffened shoulders, was brought to a hillside at Western Carolina University, still clad in a blue hospital gown and a chartreuse socks. She was laid on a bed of wood chips, and then more were heaped atop of her. If all goes as hoped, the body will turn into compost. It is a startling next step in the natural burial movement, even as more people opt for interment in simple shrouds or biodegradable caskets. Urban cemeteries continue to fill up. For the environmentally conscious, cremation is a problematic option, as the process releases greenhouse gases. Armed with prestigious environmental fellowship, Katrina Spade, a 37-year-old Seattle resident with a degree in architecture, had proposed an alternative as a facility for human composting. The idea is attracting interest from environmental advocates and scientists. The woman laid to rest in wood chips is a first step in testing how it would work. Composting makes people think of banana peels and coffee grounds, Miss Spade said, but our bodies have nutrients. What if we could grow new life after we died? Scientists agree that human beings can be composted. Already, countless farms across the country, including at least a third of Washington State's dairy farms, compost the bodies of dead livestock. In some states, transportation departments compost roadkill. I'm absolutely sure that it can work, said Lynn Carpenter Boggs, a soil scientist at Washington State University who serves on the advisory board of the Urban Death Project, a nonprofit that Ms. Spade founded. The process is surprisingly simple. Place nitrogen-rich material like dead animals inside of a mound of carbon-rich material like wood chips and sawdust, adding moisture or extra nitrogen and making other adjustments as needed. Microbial activity will start the pile cooking. Bacteria releases enzymes that break down the tissue into a component parts like amino acids, and eventually the nitrogen-rich molecules bind with the carbon-rich ones, creating a soil-like substance. Temperatures reach about 140 degrees, often higher, and the heat kills common pathogens. Done correctly, there should be no smell. Bones almost compost, though they take longer than tissue. Miss Spade has designed a building for human composting that aims to marry the efficiency of this biological process with the ritual and symbolism that mourners crave. Each urban death facility will be centered around a 3-story vault that she calls the core. Loved ones will carry their deceased wrapped in a shroud up a circular ramp to the top. There, during a laying-in ceremony, mourners will place the body inside the core, which would hold perhaps 30 corpses at a time. Over the next several weeks, each body will move down the core until the first stage of the composting was complete. In a second stage, material will be screened along with any remaining bones, and compost will be cured. Miss Spade estimates that each body combined with the necessary materials such as wood chips and sawdust will yield enough compost to fill a 3-foot cube. Weeks and months later, survivors could collect some of the compost to use as they saw fit, perhaps in their garden or to plant a tree. Miss Spade foresees the rest going to nearby parks or conservation lands. Each human composting will cost about $2,500, a fraction of the price of conventional burial, Miss Spade estimates. She hopes to build the first facility in Seattle, then develop a template that other communities can use for locally designed facilities like libraries, she said. Miss Spade, who smiles a lot, is the opposite of a funeral. She buzzes with energy and sometimes has to remind herself to talk slower. She studied sustainable agriculture before going to architecture school. The composting idea was inspired by the nurse log, a fallen tree in the forest that grows new life as it decays. It says, and here's a skeleton in a forensic anthropology lab of Western Carolina University. Beyond the environmental benefits to composting humans, she believes that there is a spiritual one. Connecting death to the cycle of nature will help people face their own mortality and bring comfort to the bereaved. Conventional burial is anything but natural. Cadavers are preserved with embalming fluid containing formaldehyde, a carcinogen. They are buried in caskets made of metal or wood and placed inside of a concrete or metal burial vault. The traditions, through commonplace in the United States, are relatively new, beginning in the Civil War, when Northern families needed to get their dead men home from the South. American ingenuity, said Gary Latterman, a professor at Emory University who specializes in the history of death in America. Embalming stuck. It said death rites can go from repugnant to normal in a surprisingly short time, said James Olson, a funeral director in Wisconsin and chairman of the Green Burial Work Group of the National Funeral Directors Association. Cremation, for instance, if I had told you 50 years ago that we were going to burn your loved ones at 2,000 degrees and pulverize their skeleton in a machine and give you back the crushed bone, she said, you would have said, ew. He said Miss Spade's concepts is wonderful. It says, first though, she and her supporters at the Urban Death Project will have to navigate an array of obstacles, not least is the yuck factor. Okay, so that's most of the article. I will have it below this video. And now I'm going to move on to how they're trying to get people to donate their organs and tissues. Article by Vice. It says why black people don't want to donate their organs. It said it's hard to make a case for the altruism in organ donation when our medical system has historically had not been altruistic to us. It was published March 29th, 2017. It says my Facebook friend recently became very passionate about organ donation. Though we haven't been real life friends for some time, his post about his mother who died waiting for an organ transplant made me question my own naivete. It has never been easier to register as a donor, but up until those daily status updates, I assumed my organs would end up wherever they were supposed to. The reality is, however, there are over 100,000 people in the waiting for an organ in the United States, and a new name is added to the registry every 10 minutes. Of that number, 30% of them are black like me. While I recently read that black people were reluctant to register as donors, my friend's post forced me to face my own suspicions about the process. Are you an organ donor? I asked my father over tea one morning. Mickey Mantle was an alcoholic, but they gave him 2 liver transplants, my dad said. I'm not letting anyone take my organs. Though my father's information is incorrect, Mantle only had 1 transplant, but he was able to procure a kidney only 48 hours after diagnosis. His sentiment is clear. The medical system cannot be trusted. My dad is not a conspiracy theorist, and history is overrun with examples of black bodies exploited in the name of science. From the notorious Tuskegee syphilis experiments to the heinous gynecological experiments that were conducted on enslaved women, most black people are raised with a strong distrust of American healthcare system. It's hard to make a case for the altruism involved in deceased organ donation when our medical system has not been altruistic to black people. While I think that the individuals that make up the organ transplant list fill it with faces of friends and loved ones who look like us, it becomes a bit more complicated. How much distrust is warranted? How much is paranoia? Now, as we know, they're using the term African American and black, and we know when they refer, these are labels that they had reclassified the American Indians as, so take that into mind. So keep that in mind. So it says, have really been targeted over the last 20 and plus years, says Jerry McCulling, chief of nephrology at Thomas Jefferson Hospital and chairman of Minority Affairs at the United Network of Organ Sharing, tells me he adds the number of deceased black donors is higher than the general population. According to the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, the total number of deceased organ donations in 2016 was 9,971, with black people contributing about 1,570. While black folks make up 13% of the population, they effectively make up about 16% of the deceased donor population. Okay, so that is very interesting and very telling. Okay. And so I'm not going to read the rest of this article, but now I'm going to go into the amount of American Indians that have been known to be kidnapped with their organs missing. Okay. Affinity, race, the illegal harvesting of black men's organs is going unnoticed, by Clay Morris on March 15th, 2017. Currently, over 118,353 people need an organ transplant, and about 22 people per day die while waiting for an organ transplant. In this situation, the phrase desperate times call for desperate measures takes on an extremely dark persona and ventures into the realm of illegal harvesting of organs. The World Health Organization reports that over 7,000 kidneys alone are harvested illegally annually, but with closer inspection at the statistics surrounding illegally harvested organs comes at an even more sinister discovery. Multiple black people have been found dead with missing organs and nothing has been said about it. Most prominent are the cases in the following four. 14-year-old Jason Smith was found dead in a lake on June 6, 2011, and his death was ruled as a drowning accident by the coroner's reports in Eros, Louisiana. Despite his and all his vital organs missing from his body, Smith's family is suspicious that this case was covered up because they believe that one of Smith's murderers is the son of an FBI agent. A petition was called for a further investigation into Smith's deaths, but it struggled to gain a few hundred signatures. Vance Anderson, a 51-year-old painter, Van Anderson died from a lung condition in 2012 and was sent to a funeral home missing his eyes, brain, heart, and pancreas. The autopsy permission form requires consent for Thomas Jefferson University Hospital to retain tissue for medical research. However, Vance Anderson's mother, Pastor Mary Anderson, says she has no recollection of consenting to the desecrating of her son's body. Mary Anderson was last reported to be suing Thomas Jefferson University Hospital for stealing her son's organs, as she stated to local Philadelphia news station WTXF, "Ain't no way in the world if they explain to me they're going to take my son and experiment with him and throw his organs in the trash, that I would have consented to that." Kendrick Johnson in Savannah, Georgia. 17-year-old Kendrick Johnson's body was uncovered January 11, 2013, inside of a rolled-up wrestling mat. Johnson's family discovered him to be missing his organs, although the South Georgia Lowndes County Sheriff's investigation ruled Johnson's death a freak accident. Subsequently, Johnson's parents contacted Dr. William R. Anderson to perform a second exhumation of the body, and a pathologist revealed that there had been intentional trauma placed on Johnson's carotid artery that seemed far distant from the signs of a freak accident. It says Dr. Anderson also discovered that the cavities where Johnson's internal organs had previously been stuffed with newspaper. Lowndes County Coroner Bill Watson said the organs of Johnson were rapidly decomposing and had to be disposed of immediately. But expert embalmers had since denied the newspaper is an acceptable filler for empty space in body cavities. Then you have Ryan Singleton, married gay model Ryan Singleton, was on a trip from Atlanta to Los Angeles when his car broke down on July 9th, 2013, in a California Valley desert. Singleton was nowhere to be found once the friend that he called for help had arrived. The San Bernardino County Coroner's Office reported that animals might have been involved. However, when Singleton's body was found, his eyes, his heart, his lungs, and liver were all gone, sparking the question of whether or not animals were sufficient enough to rule out foul play in Singleton's death among Singleton's mother and his partner, Keith Bruiser. Okay? So, this is the real reason why, that we know our people, they're being attacked, they're being hunted down like animals and being used for their body parts. And this is another reason why our people, they do not want to check off things for organ donation. And even if you don't check it off at the Secretary of State to be an organ donor, they still are coming after our people regardless. and selling these organs on the black market.
New tonight, the body snatcher accused of illegally selling body parts from a Detroit location held a going out of business sale.
People who had business dealings with this man telling Action News the same freezers he used to store arms, legs, and even heads were sold. Jeff Vaughn joins us tonight with the exclusive details on this one. Sounds crazy, Jeff.
Yeah, those electric freezers selling for just $50. Those smaller igloo coolers, sources tell me, selling for $10 a piece. And there were dozens of them sold. A Grosse Pointe Park man at the center of an FBI investigation for selling bodies in the black market had a yard sale.
Okay, now this is NBC News. It says dismembered limbs sewn together like Frankenstein at Body Parts Donation Center, FBI found. A former Phoenix FBI agent said that when he raided the Biological Resource Center, Incorporated, he observed several unsettling scenes. This was published July 26, 2019 by Alicia Fieldstein. When the FBI raided a now defunct Arizona body donation company, they found a gruesome scene, including remains from different bodies sewn together in a Frankenstein manner and buckets full of limbs, and a former agent testified. The Biological Resource Center Incorporated, its owners, employees, and other companies, including a funeral home and healthcare providers, are being sued by family members of dead people who had opted to donate their bodies solely for medical and scientific purposes. Authorities instead found that these bodies at the center were mishandled, abused, desecrated, and sold for profit, according to the suit. Mark Weiner, a former Phoenix FBI assistant special agent, recently testified for the civil suit that when the FBI raided Biological Resource Center Incorporated in 2014, he observed several unsettling scenes. I observed a large torso with the head removed and replaced with a smaller head sewn together in a Frankenstein manner. Weiner wrote, I observed body parts piled on top of each other throughout the facility with no apparent identification to indicate what bodies they came from or to whom they belonged, he said. He said buckets and coolers with various body parts, including a bucket of heads and arms and legs, were also absent of identification, as were body parts strewn in freezers. Male torsos he saw were without limbs and genitalia, he wrote. A cooler he saw was filled with male genitalia. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that. Now, on this website here, you will see it's called Atlas Obscura, the real electric Frankenstein experiments of the 1800s. So they've been doing this for quite some time. And this is something that probably the author of Frankenstein, she probably knew about this when she wrote her book Frankenstein, which is, I believe the writer was Mary Shelley. But, okay, it says why scientists during the late 18th and 19th centuries conducted crude experiments with reanimating corpses by Lauren Young. And then here you see it's an image of these men. And they have this man right here, this dead man. He's on some sort of wooden bed, and they're attaching like some sort of device that would electrify him. Okay. And it says the illustration, it says in this 1867 illustration, a crowd of scientists watch in horror as Andrew makes the lifeless body of Matthew Clydesdale tremble and twitch with electricity by Houghton Library, Harvard University. It says on November 4th, 1818, Scottish chemist Andrew stood next to the lifeless corpse of an executed murderer, the man hanging by his neck at the gallows. Only minutes before, he was performing an anatomical research demonstration for a theater filled with curious students, anatomists, and doctors at the University of Glasgow. But this was no ordinary cadaver dissection. Held two medical rods charged by a 270 plate voltaic battery to various nerves and watched in delight as the body convulsed and withered and shuddered in a grotesque dance of death. When the one rod was applied to the slight incision in the tip of the forefinger, later described to the Glasgow Literary Society, the fist being previously clenched, that finger extended instantly, and from the convulsion agitation of the arm, he seemed to point to the different spectators, some of whom thought he had come to life. Is one of the many scientists during the late 18th and 19th centuries who conducted crude experiments with galvanism, the stimulation of muscles with pulses of electrical current, the bright sparks and loud explosions made from stunning effects that lured in both scientists and artists with this era of reanimation, serving as inspiration for Mary Shelley's literary masterpiece Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. While most scientists were using galvanism to search for clues about life, wanted to see if it could actually bring someone back from the dead. This was the time when people were trying to understand the origin of life, when religion was losing some of its hold, said Juliet Burba, chief curator of the exhibit Mary and Her Monster at the Beacon Museum in Minnesota, which will open October 29th. There was a lot of interest in the question, what is the essence that animates life? Could it be electricity? The sketch of Luigi Galvini's 1780 frog muscle experiment, public domain. It says 1780, an Italian anatomy professor, Luigi Galvani, discovered that he could make the muscles of a dead frog twitch and jerk with sparks of electricity. Others quickly began to experiment by applying electricity to other animals that quickly grew morbid. Galvani's nephew, physicist Giovanni Aldini, obtained the body of an ox and proceeded to cut off the head and use electricity to twist its tongue. He set such high levels of voltage through the diaphragm of the ox that it resulted in a very strong action on the rectum, which even produced an expulsion of feces, Aldi wrote. People outside of science were also fascinated by electricity that would attend shows where bullheads and pigs were electrified and watch public dissections of research institutions such as the Company of Surgeons in England, which later became the Royal College of Surgeons. When scientists tired of testing animals, they turned to corpses, particularly corpses of murderers. In 1751, England passed the Murder Act, which allowed the bodies of executed murderers to be used for experimentation. The reason the Murder Act came about were twofold. There weren't enough bodies for anatomists, and it was seen as a further punishment for the murderer, says Burba. It was considered additional punishment to have your body dissected. Lying on Earth's table was the muscular, athletic corpse of 35-year-old coal miner Matthew Clydesdale. On August 1818, Clydesdale drunkenly murdered an 80-year-old miner with a coal pick and was sentenced to be hung at the gallows. His body remained suspended and limp for nearly an hour, while a thief who had been executed next to Clydesdale at the same time convulsed violently for several moments after death. The blood was drained from the body for half an hour before the experiments began. The 1751 Murder Act allowed scientists to run experiments on corpses of prisoners. And then here's the image of how they dissected the murderer. It says Andrew who had little to no experience with electricity, was a mere assistant to James Jeffrey and anatomy professor at the University of Glasgow. He had studied medicine at Glasgow University and served briefly as an army surgeon, but was otherwise known for teaching chemistry. Not much is known about but he was sort of a minor figure in his history of science, says Alex Bosey, the author of Elephants on Acid and Other Bizarre Experiments. Okay, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you pretty much get the gist of, what was going on in the 1700s and the 1800s and how they were doing experiments already, across the seas in Europe dealing with dead bodies. And so, who's to say that they're not doing the same thing with other people's dead relatives, So tell me, what do you think about this? To me, I feel like it's very sadistic and disgusting. But let me know what you think below about it. Until then, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm out.